The Fairfax name was once spoken with a kind of cautious reverence, the way you might whisper the name of a man who has been both king and killer, saint and heretic, a family whose wealth and influence could have shaped the country if not for the dark shadow that grew alongside it, matching them stride for stride through the centuries. A shadow born not from poverty or misfortune, but from something older, something that was already in their blood, before they ever owned a single acre of land. Their history is not written in the way polite society writes history, with grand portraits and tidy family trees, but in fragmented accounts, hidden in private journals, unsigned letters, and the testimony of those who never thought their words would leave the safety of a locked drawer. It begins not with a curse, at least not the way most people tell it, but with a series of events so small, so unremarkable, that they could easily be mistaken for coincidence. A young Fairfax man, found drowned in a well on his own estate with no sign of a struggle. A servant disappearing the night before she was meant to be married. Horses bolting in the dead of night, leaving hoofprints that stopped abruptly in the middle of a field as if they had been lifted away. Alone they were tragedies, but together they formed a pattern, one the family learned not to speak of except in whispers. It is difficult to trace the first real crack in the Fairfax image, because the Fairfax knew how to bury what needed burying. Documents were burned, witnesses were paid. Local magistrates were invited to the estate for weekends of hunting and wine, after which certain inconvenient inquests would simply vanish from the record. But if you look carefully, the signs are there. In the winter of 1798, a Fairfax patriarch, Thomas Fairfax II, quietly purchased land that was said to be unfit for crops, land the locals avoided because of the sound of low, unbroken chanting that came from the woods on certain nights. Within 2 years, the family fortune grew at an unnatural rate, aided by business deals in which their rivals seemed to collapse overnight through scandal, accident, or madness. The coincidence was noted by some, but those who noted it too loudly were not often heard from again. Even now, the surviving letters from that period are strange to read, as if the writer could not bring himself to put his real thoughts into words, as if even paper was unsafe. By the middle of the 19th century, the Fairfax estate had become both a symbol of opulence and an unspoken warning. The family threw lavish gatherings where the finest families came to dine under the glow of imported chandeliers. Yet those same guests often reported a subtle unease, an inexplicable heaviness that clung to the corridors, as though the very air carried the weight of things unseen. Several guests wrote privately that they would not return, citing dreams of being watched from the shadows of their rooms, the sound of footsteps just outside their doors, and the faint but unmistakable scent of blood beneath the smell of polished wood and perfume. The Fairfax themselves never commented on such claims, and the few servants who worked there long enough to be trusted often developed a habit of averting their gaze when certain topics arose. A kitchen maid named Eleanor Clark, who left the estate in 1847, claimed in her old age that things were buried under that house that should have been left in the ground, though she refused to elaborate, even when offered money. The most dangerous knowledge about the Fairfax is not in their public deeds, but in their private patterns, the way each generation seemed to repeat the sins of the last, not out of ignorance, but as if compelled. They married into certain families, often ones with their own stains of scandal or whispered ties to forbidden practices. They arranged inheritances in ways that appeared to deliberately provoke resentment and infighting. There are letters in the county archives, yellowed and water-damaged, from younger Fairfax sons pleading with their elder brothers to break free of the design, a phrase that appears often in these documents but is never defined. It is possible that the design referred to a business strategy or political scheme, but in the context of these letters, it feels older, ritualistic, as though they were bound to follow rules that were not of their own making. Several of these letters end abruptly, mid-sentence, the ink smeared as if by a sudden spill or a shaking hand. Of all the family secrets, perhaps the most chilling is the way certain events seem to vanish, not just from records, but from memory itself. In 1873, a child of the main Fairfax line, 8-year-old Lydia, is recorded in the parish register as having been baptized. Yet no death record exists, and by the time of the 1881 census, she is simply gone, with no mention in family correspondence, no grave, no mourning period. When a researcher asked a living Fairfax descendant about Lydia in the 1970s, he reportedly stared in silence for several seconds before saying he had never heard the name, and then, without explanation, ending the interview. This was not unusual. Entire names disappear from the Fairfax history, as though erased by some unseen hand. Sometimes, when old wills surface, they list beneficiaries who were never born according to the official family tree. The result is a genealogy that feels less like a record of life and more like a carefully maintained illusion. Those who study such things often argue about whether the Fairfax secrecy was purely a means of protecting their wealth and influence, or whether it masked something deeper, something that, if exposed, would unravel the family's entire identity. Some point to the recurring symbols found in the margins of old Fairfax ledgers, interlocking circles with a line through the center, small crosses enclosed in a triangle symbols also found carved into the beams of the estate's oldest wing, a part of the house now sealed off. Others note the strange alignment of Fairfax properties across counties, their locations forming geometric shapes when plotted on a map, as though the land itself was chosen according to rules no one outside the family understood. Whether these patterns were coincidence, superstition, or something darker is a matter of debate. But those who investigate too deeply have a way of withdrawing from the subject without explanation, as if they have learned something they would rather forget. The Fairfax themselves never admitted to the existence of any curse, at least not in public, but there are recorded moments of startling candor in private accounts. In 1906, a guest at the estate, a distant cousin named Henry Collingwood, wrote in his diary that after a late supper, the then head of the family leaned in close and whispered, "We do not keep the secret. A secret keeps us." Collingwood did not specify what this meant, but he left the estate the next morning without saying goodbye and never returned. His diary ends abruptly a few weeks later. This is the pattern with those who glimpse too much entries cut off mid-thought. Correspondence that stops without warning, public lives that dissolve into obscurity. Perhaps the most unsettling thing about the Fairfax secrets is how ordinary they can seem at first glance, how easily they could be mistaken for the eccentricities of old money. An unlit wing of the house closed for repairs for decades. A garden statue moved slightly from one season to the next without explanation. Fires in the library that seemed to occur just as certain archives are scheduled for public review. But when you begin to place these moments alongside the unexplained deaths, the disappearances, the deliberate erasures from memory, they take on a different character. The Fairfax were not merely hiding scandals. They were preserving something, guarding it with the devotion of priests, and whatever it was, it demanded both silence and sacrifice. If you speak to locals near the old estate today, you will find the same reluctance to discuss the family, a quiet closing of the subject before it has even begun. Some will tell you they are simply tired of the stories, that nothing remains of the Fairfax but a crumbling house and a line of faded portraits. But if you watch their eyes when you mention certain names or dates, you will see the flicker of something else, not disbelief, not exactly fear, but the recognition of a boundary that should not be crossed. It is the same expression found in the oldest Fairfax photographs, a kind of knowledge that weighs down the gaze, that makes the eyes seem older than the face. Whatever the family's secret was, it did not die with them, and perhaps it was never truly theirs to begin with. It was something they inherited, something that chose them long before they knew enough to choose otherwise. And it is still there, waiting in the silence between the words they left behind. The Fairfax family curse is not the kind of tale that begins with lightning splitting the sky or a witch screaming a name into the wind. It begins quietly with a single decision made in a moment when the weight of a man's ambition outweighed his sense of consequence. The earliest accounts that speak of a curse come not from folklore, but from a set of private papers belonging to Richard Fairfax in the late 17th century. A man known for his skill in negotiation and his ruthless patience when cornered. According to the faded ink and brittle parchment, Richard was facing the loss of a shipping contract that would have destroyed his fortune and perhaps a family's claim to their lands entirely. It was during these months that he was said to have traveled far from the estate into a remote and inhospitable region, where he met a man described only as a figure in a black coat with eyes that reflected no light. The meeting is mentioned just once in his correspondence. Yet all who read that line understood it to be the origin point of something that could not be undone. When Richard returned, the contract was not only saved, but expanded. His rivals suddenly faced ruin, their ships lost to storms, their warehouses burned under circumstances the magistrates could never explain. From that year forward, the Fairfax wealth grew unnaturally fast, and with it came a shadow of misfortune that fell on those closest to them, but rarely on the family itself. The pattern was subtle enough at first to be dismissed as chance, a business partner losing a child to sudden illness, a neighbor's fields blighted, while Fairfax crops thrived in the same season. Yet, as the decades passed, the misfortunes deepened, turning inward, touching the family in ways that could not be hidden no matter how hard they tried. There is a record in the county registry of Margaret Fairfax in 1724, who fell ill after hearing voices calling her name at night. She insisted they were not dreams, for she could recount the words exactly, and claimed the voices told her she must leave the estate before the 13th night, or she would never leave at all on the 12th night. She attempted to flee, but was found at dawn in the gardens, her face pale, her eyes open and fixed on something no one else could see. She lingered for weeks, speaking less and less, until she died. The doctor called it wasting sickness, though in the margin of his notes he wrote a single question: what did she see? The curse is never named as such in the Fairfax ledgers, but there are marks, symbols drawn in the margins beside certain entries, symbols that match those carved into the beams of the oldest barn and into the undersides of furniture. So they are never seen unless the pieces overturned. One investigator in the early 20th century, who was allowed into the estate to catalog its contents, noted these markings in his report, but within 2 months of his visit, he was found dead in his study with the papers he had written scattered across the floor, many of them missing, entire pages torn out and never recovered. His death was ruled natural causes, but those who knew him swore he had been in perfect health. Those who spoke privately about the Fairfax curse did not describe it as a spell that struck suddenly, but as something that grew slowly from within, a kind of rot that began the moment a child was born into the family. It was said that Fairfax children were often quiet watchers, more than talkers, as if they were listening to something just beyond the range of ordinary, hearing some developed fevers in their youth that caused them to speak in strange tongues, words that their parents claimed not to understand, though in certain letters preserved in a sealed archive, it is clear at least some of the parents did understand and feared it greatly. The supernatural elements of the curse were whispered, but never admitted publicly, and yet they linger in every fragment of surviving record. There is the account of the 1811 midsummer gathering, when the family's hounds began howling at midnight, and would not be silenced until a window shattered in the great hall, sending shards of glass across the floor, despite no wind and no intruder. There is the 1853 wedding, when the bride of Fairfax's daughter collapsed at the altar, whispering a single phrase again and again, until her voice failed her. Those who stood close claimed the words were not in any language they recognized, but sounded rehearsed, almost ritualistic. The marriage never took place, and the young woman was sent abroad for her health. She died there less than a year later, the official cause recorded as an accident. It is tempting to explain these events as superstition, a family cursed only in their own minds. Yet, there are moments when the curse takes on the weight of something colder and more deliberate. During the winter famine of 1891, when livestock across the county starved, the Fairfax herds remained untouched, healthy, and fat enough to sell at a great profit. When questioned, the family claimed they had simply prepared better for the season. But several farmhands who left their employ that year told a different story. They spoke of feed laced with a black powder brought in crates without labels. They spoke of being ordered to burn the remains of animals that had died strangely, with their eyes still wide open and no wounds to explain their deaths. The darker mystery is not whether the curse is real, but whether it was chosen, whether some ancestor of the Fairfax entered into an agreement, knowing it would not only enrich them, but mark every bloodline that followed for centuries. There are fragments of a diary attributed to Catherine Fairfax in the early 1800s, in which she writes of a debt that grows with the living, and of keepers who walk unseen beside us. Her final entry reads simply, "I feel it near tonight, the debt will not be mine alone." Perhaps the most disturbing account comes from much later, in 1934, when a young heir named Edward Fairfax was sent to a private school in the North. The headmaster recalled Edward as polite, intelligent, but prone to long absences from class, where he claimed he had been called outside. When pressed, he would only say they wanted to see me in spring of that year. Edward vanished entirely, leaving behind his clothes neatly folded on his bed, and a note written in a firm hand that said, "I have gone." To settle the account, the family did not search for him, at least not publicly. The matter was never reported to police, and his name was quietly removed from the genealogical records as though he had never existed. By the late 20th century, the curse was less spoken of, even in whispers, yet its presence remained in the pattern of events. Sudden illnesses, divorces, bankruptcies occurring not just to family members, but to those who came too close. Archivists, journalists, historians, some survived, but all carried the same expression when the Fairfax name was mentioned afterward: a quiet flattening of the eyes, a subtle shift in tone, as if speaking of something that listens and remembers. And so the Fairfax curse stands not as a piece of folklore meant to entertain, but as a living thing stretching across centuries, weaving itself into contracts, inheritances, marriages, and deaths, a presence felt more than seen, one that seems to demand a price for the family's survival, a price that can never be paid in full. For every account suggests that the debt is still open, and that the Fairfax, whatever remains of them, are still bound to it, whether they understand it or not, whether they want to be or not. The disappearance of the Fairfax family is not remembered the way a single tragedy is remembered. It is remembered the way a silence is remembered, a sudden, hollow space in the air where something once existed and then, without warning, was gone. It happened in the autumn of 1965, when the estate stood in the last light of its grandeur, the walls still polished, the gardens still kept, though fewer servants walked the halls, and the family no longer entertained as they once had. The official account says that the Fairfax simply left for an extended absence. There are notes from a solicitor stating the family had business abroad, yet the dates do not match the reality, for no one saw them leave, no carriages, no cars, no train tickets purchased. No one at the docks recalls their faces. In truth, they vanished in a way that left no natural explanation. Neighbors first grew suspicious when the milk left at the gate went untouched for days. The groundskeeper, a man named Harris, who had worked the estate for over 30 years, claimed he came one morning to find the front doors wide open, the air inside still warm from the previous night, fires in the hearths still Burning low, but no sign of the people who had been there hours before breakfast plates sat on the long dining table chairs, pushed back slightly as though the diners had risen, and walked away in the middle of a meal. There were no signs of struggle, no broken glass, no overturned furniture, yet the house felt wrong. Harris told the constable it was as if the rooms were holding their breath. When police entered, they found clothes laid out on beds as if ready to be worn, letters on desks. With pens still wet with ink, the last words trailing into nothing in the study, the clock had stopped at 2:47, though no one could explain why the family. Dogs were found locked in the stables without food or water, and despite their hunger, they refused to enter the main house, whining and growling when led toward the door as if something inside repelled them entirely. One officer later admitted to feeling physically ill the moment he crossed the threshold, though he could not say why. The press caught the story, and for a few weeks it seemed the disappearance might be solved. Theories swirled from kidnapping to voluntary exile to elaborate hoax, but none fit the facts. No ransom demands were made, no bank accounts touched, no sightings confirmed by credible witnesses. There were rumors of strange marks found in the cellar, shallow carvings in the stone floor, resembling a series of concentric circles, broken by sharp lines. These were never mentioned in official reports, and photographs supposedly taken of them were said to have been misplaced by the evidence clerk who left the force a year later without explanation. Some believed the Fairfax had been caught in the web of their own curse, that whatever debt had been accruing over the centuries had finally come due. There is an account from a former maid named Agnes, who claimed she had been dismissed 2 weeks before the disappearance. She said that in her final days at the estate, she heard voices not inside her head, but rising from beneath the floorboards, low and rhythmic, as if in chant. She swore she saw the eldest son, Nicholas, standing in the garden at night speaking to someone. She could not see his breath visible in the cold air, yet his words, too quiet to make out. When she called to him, he turned as though startled, but his expression was not that of a man caught in some private moment, was the expression of someone who had been found in the middle of something he could not explain. In the years since, there have been those who claim to know more. A retired constable in the late 1980s said over drink that a section of the cellar had been bricked off just days before the disappearance, as if sealing something inside. But when asked why the police had not broken it open, he said quietly that they had been told not to by someone higher up, he refused to name, who, when pressed, his hands shook so violently he spilled his glass. Others whispered of a note found in the library, tucked between the pages of an old ledger, written in a hurried hand. It read, "They are coming sooner than we thought. Leave the gates unlocked." There were no funerals for the Fairfax, no bodies to bury. The estate passed into the hands of distant relatives who sold much of the land and locked the main house. The keys supposedly lost, though from time to time lights were seen flickering in the upper windows years after the last known occupant had gone. Some said squatters, others said thieves, yet nothing was ever taken and no footprints found in the dust. When authorities checked in the winter of 1972, an urban explorer claimed to have entered through a broken window and found the dining table still set with plates, now dulled with dust and cobwebs. The food long rotted away, but in the corner of the room, a set of footprints led toward the wall and simply stopped as if the person had stepped into thin air. The darker mystery lies not in the fact that the Fairfax disappeared, but in what has happened since for the land where the estate stands has seen its own strange vanishings over the decades. Hikers going off path and never returning, workers repairing. The outer walls found their tools moved in the night, voices calling their names from the tree line. Even when they were alone some nights, the air is said to vibrate faintly as though with distant machinery, though there is nothing for miles. One former caretaker swore he saw figures standing in the upstairs, window silhouettes watching in perfect stillness, yet when he entered the house, no one was there. There are whispers, too, of a ledger discovered in a hidden compartment of the study desk listing names, dates, and amounts, the last entries. Marked in red ink with the words account settled beside them, the final name on the list is Nicholas Fairfax. Dated the night of the disappearance, no other Fairfax name appears after that, and the column for payment received is left blank, as though whatever took them had not yet been satisfied. Even now, those who try to investigate find themselves meeting dead ends, records, misfiled documents, missing interviews, cut short by sudden illness or inexplicable fear. Those who have walked the estate grounds speak of a pressure in the air that grows heavier the closer one comes to the house. Some hear faint footsteps on the gravel path behind them, only to turn and find nothing. The building itself seems to wait in silence. Its windows dark, its doors locked, yet one cannot shake the sense that something inside is still there, something that has not finished what it began in 1965, and perhaps will not finish until it takes the last name from whatever list it still keeps. There is a truth about the Fairfax family that has nothing to do with rumor or superstition, and everything to do with what people are willing to do when they believe they will never be caught. A truth so deeply buried that even those who served them for decades only caught glimpses of it in half-overheard conversations and hurriedly closed doors. This truth is that behind the polished facade of wealth and grace, there was a network of dealings darker than anything whispered about curses or hauntings. The Fairfax did not simply inherit their fortune, they maintained it. Through acts that could not bear daylight, there are letters hidden in archives that are stamped as private, sealed under legal orders for 100 years. Letters written in the family's own hand, arranging the quiet removal of individuals who posed a problem. Sometimes these were rivals in business, sometimes distant relatives who threatened to reveal something they were not meant to know. The language is coded yet unmistakable, a phrase like "he will not trouble us after next week," or "the matter will be resolved at the usual location." The usual location is mentioned enough times to suggest it was a specific place, one that no map marks and no local will speak of. Some have guessed it was a section of the old forest on the edge of the estate, where the ground sinks unnaturally and no birds are heard. Others claim it was beneath the estate itself, in the section of the cellar bricked over just before the disappearance, but those who speak too long about it seem to lose their nerve, as if recalling not just the story, but the feeling it left in them. There are also records of servants who left suddenly in the middle of the night, without pay or references, never to be heard from again, as if they had seen something and knew their only chance of survival was to vanish before the family realized they knew. Among the most chilling discoveries are a series of journals written by a governess in the late 19th century, who described the children she cared for as unusually quiet and watchful. She claimed they spoke to one another in whispers when they believed she was not listening, using words she could not understand. Once she caught the eldest daughter burying a small bundle wrapped in cloth at the base of an oak tree. When she demanded to see it, the girl began to cry and fled. The governess dug it up and found what appeared to be a bird, but its wings had been sewn shut with black thread and its eyes covered with small discs of silver. When she confronted the parents, they told her plainly to leave the matter alone, or she would be dismissed. By the end of the week, she did not take their advice and was gone before the month ended. The journal stops abruptly in the middle of a sentence. There is also the matter of the Black Ledger, a book bound in calfskin that appears in estate inventories as far back as 1802 and then vanishes from official records entirely. A former steward claimed it contained not financial accounts, but lists of names arranged in no apparent order. Beside each name were dates and strange markings, some resembling crosses, others resembling sigils known from old occult traditions. No one knows where the ledger went, but some believe it is the same book, found decades later in the hidden compartment of the study desk with the account-settled entries. It is said that whoever possessed it could not keep it for long without meeting a violent or inexplicable end. One of the darker truths the family kept was their connection to disappearances beyond their own bloodline in the surrounding villages. There are tales of children vanishing on nights when lights were seen in the upper windows of the Fairfax house. Or when strange fires burned in the far fields, villagers would search, but the children were never found, and within days, the searches would be called off without reason. In more than one case, the missing child's family would suddenly receive an anonymous sum of money enough to settle debts or purchase new land. No one dared ask where it came from. In 1949, a school teacher named Lawrence Harker began compiling a private file on these incidents, noting how the dates often aligned with key moments in Fairfax history, such as inheritances, business acquisitions, and marriages. He traced the pattern back nearly 2 centuries, but before he could publish his findings, he was struck by a car on a quiet road just outside town. The driver was never identified. His notes vanished from his home. The same night, his widow claimed 2 men in dark coats arrived and searched the house for hours, taking only the box that contained his papers. She never saw them again. The most disturbing suggestion from those who have studied the Fairfax is that the curse and the family's actions were not separate matters, but 2 sides of the same design, that the family's survival and prosperity required certain acts to be committed, acts that ensured the curse's hunger was fed without consuming them. Entirely, if this is true, then the disappearances of outsiders, the silencing of relatives, and the hidden rituals were not desperate attempts to fight the curse, but the very means of sustaining it, and by extension the Fairfax themselves. Some believe the family entered willingly into this arrangement centuries ago, and that each generation was taught the rules of it. As they came of age, those who refused to participate either met with sudden death or, like Edward Fairfax in 1934, disappeared, completely, their names erased from memory. There is a final rumor spoken so rarely that even those who pass it on are unsure, if they believe it themselves, that somewhere within the estate, perhaps in that sealed section of the cellar, lies not the remains of victims, but something still alive, something the Fairfax were tasked with guarding and feeding, something that could not be killed, only contained. The idea is dismissed as fantasy by most, yet it persists, and those who have dared to approach the estate at night swear they have heard low sounds rising from beneath the ground, sounds too deep to be human, yet too rhythmic to be the wind the air over the estate feels, different on such nights, heavy, and still, as though the earth itself is holding its breath, waiting. If this is true, then the disappearance in 1965 was not an end, but a withdrawal, a moment when the family stepped fully into the service of whatever they had bound themselves to, leaving behind only the shell of a house and a land marked by generations of silence and blood. The darker truth is that the Fairfax secret did not die with them. It may not even belong to them. It may be the kind of thing that waits patiently for the right hands to take up the work again, and perhaps those hands are already moving unseen, preparing the way for the next chapter of a history that has never truly ended. The connection between the Fairfax family and the Order of the Solar Temple is one of those truths that most researchers refuse to put in writing, because to name it outright is to invite attention from people who do not want it named. The Order was a real organization, its existence documented in police records and court archives across Europe. It was a cult wrapped in ritual and secrecy, with a belief system drawn from fragments of Templar myths, apocalyptic prophecy, and obscure occult texts. It is known for its involvement in mass deaths, staged as suicides, for its influence over the wealthy, and for its hunger for power, disguised as spiritual enlightenment. And yet, while the world knows the public history, the deeper layers have always remained buried, and it is in those deeper layers that the Fairfax name appears. The first hint comes in the form of a passenger manifest from 1952, showing a Nicholas Fairfax traveling under an assumed name to Geneva, the same city where the Order maintained one of its most important lodges at the time. There is no record of him returning through official channels, yet within months the Fairfax estate underwent expensive renovations, including the ceiling of the old cellar, wing. This timing is too precise for some to ignore, in the personal notes of a former Swiss police investigator now long deceased. There is a scribbled reference to an Englishman with ties to an old estate who attended private gatherings of the order and made significant financial contributions. These gatherings were not the public recruitment ceremonies known to outsiders, but closed rituals involving a small circle of members whose names were never meant to be recorded. In the Fairfax archives, there is a set of photographs undeveloped for decades, until a collector purchased them at a forgotten estate sale. They show a room lit entirely by candlelight, a circle of robed figures surrounding what appears to be stone altar. In the center of the altar is an object covered in a heavy cloth, though its outline suggests a shape far from human. In one photograph, the figure at the head of the circle looks directly at the camera, his face partly obscured, but his family signet ring clearly visible, a ring known to have belonged to a Fairfax patriarch at the time. This evidence never reached the public, for the collector who developed the photographs died before he could sell them. His home burned within days. The negatives vanished. What makes the Fairfax connection more disturbing is that the Order of the Solar Temple was obsessed with the idea of continuation, that death was not an end, but a transition, and that certain bloodlines carried within them a key to influence what came after. It is said the Fairfax were not merely donors or passive participants. They were part of the bloodline. The order considered essential for its higher workings. Some whisper that this is why the family's curse never ended, because it was never a curse in the traditional sense, but a binding pact reinforced through generations of ritual, and the order's intervention may have been to ensure its continuation rather than to free them from it. The order was known to stage elaborate reenactments of mythical events, combining medieval symbols with modern tools, but for the Fairfax, the rituals may have been more personal accounts from former lower-ranking members who escaped the group speak, of ceremonies in which participants were required to surrender something of great personal value, not money, but something tied to their identity in ways they could not replace. Hair, teeth, blood, and in some cases, even the lives of those closest. To them, the Fairfax, it is believed, gave more than most, and in return, they were given not just influence, but protection, the kind that allowed them to vanish without trace in 1965, leaving behind a house filled with signs of departure, but no trace of where they went. There is a darker suggestion among those who have pieced together fragments of the Fairfax history that the order did not merely use the family, but that the family used the order to complete something they could not do alone, perhaps the entity or force they were bound to required a network to feed it, and the order provided that network, stretching across continents and reaching into places no single family could touch. In this version of events, the Fairfax disappearance was not an escape from the curse, but an ascension into its service fully and without the pretense of resistance. One former investigator who had been studying the order in connection to unexplained deaths in rural England claimed he received an anonymous envelope containing a single page from a Fairfax ledger. On it was a date several years after the family's disappearance, and beside it a location in the Swiss Alps where an underground chamber was later discovered by accident during construction. The chamber contained a table carved from black stone, strange symbols etched into the walls, and in the center a metal box sealed shut so tightly it could not be opened. Without destroying it, the workers who found it reported a deep humming sound coming from inside before the site was sealed and all materials confiscated. No one knows where the box went. If the Fairfax are still alive in some form, there are those who believe they are hidden within what remains of the Order of the Solar Temple, not as captives, but as custodians carrying out rituals for purposes known only to themselves and whatever force their family has served for centuries. Some even claim that the Fairfax disappearance was a ritual in itself, that on a specific night in 1965. The family gathered in the Great Hall, performed the final rite, and walked willingly into whatever waited for them, leaving behind a shell of a house and a legacy, so thoroughly entangled with darkness that untangling it may be impossible. The most unsettling theory is that the Fairfax did not vanish from the world at all, but moved into a space just beyond it, kept there by the same rituals the order was founded to perform, and that from this place they can still influence events, here subtly shaping misfortunes and disappearances as payment for the protection they receive in return. If this is true, then Fairfax's name is not a ghost story from the past. It is a living presence still connected to a network older and more dangerous than any single cult, and still watching for the moment it must act again. The Family International is not the kind of group most people hear about unless they go looking for the shadows behind the news headlines. Its origins buried in the counterculture of the late 60s and early 70s, when charismatic leaders used peace, love, and spiritual awakening as bait for something far more controlled and far more dangerous on the surface it presented itself as a movement of idealists rejecting materialism, building communities dedicated to faith and brotherhood. But beneath the smiles and guitar circles lay a structure designed for manipulation, for secrecy, and for binding its members into a lifetime of service. The Fairfax name is not one you will find in the public records of this group, but if you trace certain donations, properties, and the movement of individuals through the decades, the lines begin to connect in ways that suggest far more than coincidence. It begins with a small property purchase in 1971 on the outskirts of Buenos Aires, listed under a shell company, with no public ties to the Fairfax, yet the company itself was incorporated in London, using the services of a law firm historically tied to the family. Within months of the purchase, the property became a communal living space for foreign members of the Family International, many of whom arrived without clear documentation, and some of whom would later be linked to missing person cases from Europe and North America. When questioned, local authorities could never find an owner willing to speak to them, and paperwork inquiries always led back to offices that no longer existed. This pattern repeated in other countries. A farmhouse in rural France, a former boarding school in Kenya, an abandoned estate in New Zealand, all purchased through intermediaries and all eventually used by the group as isolated centers for their activities. The Family International had its own doctrine about chosen bloodlines, individuals believed to have been selected by divine will to lead or to channel spiritual energy. The rhetoric was different from that of the Order of the Solar Temple, but the fixation on lineage was eerily similar, and the Fairfax, with their long and troubled history, fit neatly into this obsession. There are reports from former members describing a pale Englishwoman with an aristocratic accent who would appear at certain gatherings accompanied by two silent men, always dressed in dark suits. She was said to conduct private sessions with the leadership and then disappear without warning some claim. She called herself Margaret, though her name was never confirmed. Photographs from these events are rare, but one grainy image smuggled out of a compound in the Philippines shows a woman with the same high cheekbones and angular jaw seen in Fairfax portraits from the 1930s. What makes the connection even more unsettling is the group's history of moving children between communities, sometimes across borders, without consent of their families. Under the guise of spiritual training, some of these children were later said to have been placed in the care of benefactors who provided resources for the group in exchange for influence and protection. There is a chilling story from a defector about a boy with the Fairfax surname brought into a South American commune. In the late 70s, he spoke little to anyone, but seemed to receive deference from the elders, and was often taken away for days at a time, returning with strange injuries and a demeanor that shifted between fear and cold detachment. No record of this boy exists outside of the testimony. Investigators who have tried to follow the money find themselves lost in a labyrinth of offshore accounts, trusts, and foundations, many registered in the same jurisdictions favored by the Fairfax for generations. Cayman Islands, Panama, Jersey each. Step revealing another layer of concealment, and each trail ending abruptly, as if someone were deliberately erasing the paper before it could be read in full. One, retired financial crimes officer admitted off record that every time they got close to linking a Fairfax account to the Family International, the case was reassigned or shut down without explanation. The ideological overlap between the Fairfax past and the teachings of the Family International suggests a shared understanding of control. Through belief, both relied on symbols, rituals, and the constant reinforcement of the idea that some people are destined for more than others, that the world is a place to be shaped by those with the will and the means to do so, while the Order of the Solar Temple framed it in mystical terms and apocalypse. The Family International cloaked it in love, prophecy, and the creation of a new generation unbound by the old rules. Together, they form a dual strand of influence, one overtly spiritual and the other quietly manipulative, a combination that could sustain a network far longer than any single organization could survive on its own. There is a story whispered among defectors about a meeting in the early 1980s where leaders from both groups were present, though no one outside that room can confirm it. The location said to be an estate in the Swiss countryside supposedly featured a long dining table set with silver bearing the Fairfax crest. The agenda was never recorded, but after that year, several disappearances tied to the Family International occurred in regions where the order had previously been active, and in each case the missing persons were last seen in the company of foreign visitors with British accents. What may be the darkest possibility is that the Fairfax were not simply supporting the Family International, but using it as a vessel to continue their own legacy, hiding behind the group's public scandals and controversies while moving unseen through its structure, influencing its direction, and perhaps even selecting certain members for purposes that have nothing to do with the group's stated beliefs. If this is true, then every raid, every investigation, every journalistic expose has been little more than a distraction, keeping attention on the surface, while the real machinery turns quietly in the depths, where no one is allowed to look. Some former insiders claimed that the Fairfax interest in the Family International was never about faith at all, but about access to people in vulnerable states, to isolated properties across continents, and to networks capable of moving anyone or anything across borders without detection. If these claims hold even a grain of truth, then the Fairfax may have found in the Family International the perfect modern extension of the same pact and power they nurtured in the Order of the Solar Temple. Only this time the disguise was so complete that even when glimpsed, it was dismissed as coincidence or conspiracy theory. If the Fairfax bloodline truly weaves through both of these organizations, then their reach is not the fading shadow of an old curse, but a living system, a lattice of influence spanning decades and continents, and still growing beneath the surface, waiting perhaps for a signal only they will recognize. And when that moment comes, it will not matter how much of the truth has been uncovered, because those who know will already be too late to stop it. The haunted legacy of the Fairfax name is not confined to whispered rumors or yellowed documents. It clings to places, objects, and people, like a living shadow, and those who have come too close speak of an atmosphere that is not merely unsettling, but actively oppressive. The old Fairfax estate in Northumberland, now long abandoned, still stands against the wind and rain, its windows boarded, its gates chained, yet those who trespass tell of lights moving through the upper floors and voices drifting across the fields in languages they cannot identify. Sometimes there are footsteps on the gravel path long before the gate is reached. Other times the sound of slow, deliberate knocking from somewhere deep inside, even though the house should be empty. The deeper mystery begins when one notices that the estate is not truly abandoned. There are signs of recent occupation: cigarette butts still fresh in the drive, a generator that hums at odd hours, a single curtain drawn back in one upstairs room. As though someone were watching, there is also the matter of the sealed cellar where local builders refused to work. After one man collapsed without warning, claiming he felt someone breathing on the back of his neck. When he turned, there was no one. There his co-workers swore his skin was icy and his pupils blown wide as though he had seen something impossible. Objects tied to the family carry their own strange weight. A silver locket engraved with the Fairfax crest, sold at auction in 1998, was later returned by its buyer, who claimed it caused violent nightmares and made his dog howl for hours each night. A leather-bound diary found in a second-hand bookshop in London contained several pages written in what experts could not agree was any known language, and on one page an ink drawing of a door with no frame or walls around it, just a black rectangle. Surrounded by small human figures, all bowing toward it, those who have studied it too, long report a creeping headache and an irrational sense of being watched. There is also the recurring figure of a pale boy, seen in different parts of the world, always alone, always silent, always gone. When approached, he has been spotted near a Fairfax-owned vineyard in Italy, in the hallway of a Cape Town hotel and inn. The background of a family wedding photograph, taken in Vancouver, the guests swear no such boy attended, and yet his face matches that of the unidentified child described by the Family International defector decades earlier. More chilling still are the patterns in death records across multiple countries, stretching back over century clusters of unexplained fatalities. Near properties linked to the Fairfax, each incident dismissed as coincidence, an outbreak of illness, a freak accident, a sudden fire, but when mapped together, they form a trail leading from England to Switzerland to Argentina to Australia, and always circling back within a few miles of a Fairfax residence or holding. What remains unanswered is whether these phenomena are the byproducts of human cruelty and calculated manipulation, or if something older, darker, and far less human has bound itself to the Fairfax line through blood or bargain. Some suggest the family has been keeping something locked away for generations, not out of mercy, but out of control, and that the true curse is not their misfortune, but their guardianship of whatever it is. Those who believe this point to the estate's sealed cellar and the accounts of muffled sounds that rise from it uncertain. Night's deep thuds scraping like stone against stone, and once a long, slow exhale that made frost bloom across the inside. Of the cellar door in the height of summer, the locks on that door are not new, but layered one over another, as if each generation added its own, and yet none dared to remove the ones before, perhaps because to open it is to invite whatever waits. Allow to finish what it began centuries ago. If there is a final layer to the Fairfax mystery, it may be that the family is neither cursed nor corrupted, but complicit willing stewards of a force that rewards them in ways outsiders cannot measure, perhaps in influence, perhaps in wealth, or perhaps in something far stranger, something that allows the same names to reappear in history, again and again, unchanged by time, watching from the edges, waiting for the next turn of the wheel, when the seal breaks and the old bargain must be renewed. The most compelling evidence to emerge in recent years did not come from an historian or a paranormal investigator, but from a retired archivist who claimed to have stumbled upon a collection of documents hidden in the false wall of a municipal records room in Geneva. The papers, brittle and water-stained, bore the cheap Fairfax crest, along with dates spanning from the late 1800s to the mid-1990s. And while some of the text was mundane in nature, land transactions, shipping manifests, tax receipts, other pages contained lists of names, times, and obscure symbols, sometimes accompanied by a single red fingerprint at the bottom, as though someone had signed in blood. The archivist said he made copies before the documents were quietly removed by unknown men who identified themselves as private security working for a European banking consortium, but among the copies was one letter that seemed to defy explanation. Written in an archaic style, yet postmarked in 1974, it described in detail a ceremony to be held in a subterranean location near Lake Geneva. The letter referenced a convergence of 3 bloodlines, including the Fairfax, and spoke of opening the ninth passage to ensure the continuity of dominion for another 50 years. What the ninth passage is, or was, remains unclear, though cross-referencing with older Fairfax diaries shows the phrase appearing sporadically, always in proximity to a death or disappearance. Adding to the mystery, a set of photographs surfaced from a closed police archive in Buenos Aires depicting the aftermath of what was officially recorded as a gas explosion in 1962. The images show charred walls and collapsed ceilings, yet in the center of the main room stands a stone archway entirely intact and unmarked by fire. Upon the archway are etched the same symbols seen in the Geneva documents, alongside what appeared to be crude depictions of human figures kneeling before something. Above them, something that could not be fully seen because the upper portion of the carving was chipped away. Criminologists who examined these findings privately have suggested that the Fairfax family may have been deeply embedded in a network that spanned continents, blending financial power with ritualistic practices that went beyond simple cult activity. There is speculation that these rituals were not merely symbolic, but were believed to confer tangible influence over events, economic downturns, political assassinations, even the outcomes of wars. Some skeptics argue that the cult connections are exaggerated or even fabricated to explain what could simply be the ruthless pragmatism of an old and powerful family, yet even they struggle to explain why so many independent sources point to the same dates, the same locations, the same inexplicable patterns of death and disappearance. Perhaps the most unsettling evidence came from a vault discovered beneath an abandoned Fairfax warehouse in Rotterdam during a redevelopment project. The workers who found it described a narrow iron staircase leading down into a chamber lined with shelves containing hundreds of glass jars, each filled with a cloudy amber liquid, and inside each jar something that looked disturbingly organic, small pale shapes, twisted and curled, some recognizably human in form, others not quite so identifiable. No official report was made, because the site was cordoned off within hours, and the jars were removed in unmarked crates by men who spoke little and refused to answer questions. To those who have followed the Fairfax story for decades, these discoveries are not isolated incidents, but pieces of a puzzle that has been deliberately scattered across time and geography, a puzzle that, when assembled, points toward a single chilling conclusion: the Fairfax family has been protecting and perhaps serving an agenda far older than their own name, an agenda that requires secrecy, sacrifice, and the careful shaping of history itself. There are hints that this agenda is not entirely under their control, that they may be as bound to it as those who have vanished in its shadow, and that the real danger is not in what they have done, but in what they are still preparing to do. And if the ninth passage mentioned in the Geneva letter truly refers to an event set on a 50-year cycle, then the next alignment may already be approaching, perhaps even within our lifetime. And if that is true, then the strange lights over the Northumberland estate, the sightings of the pale boy in distant cities, the locked cellar that breathes in the dark, may not be remnants of a dying curse, but harbingers of something about to wake again, something the Fairfax cannot contain this time. In the end, when we try to separate myth from reality in the Fairfax story, we are forced to confront an uncomfortable possibility that perhaps the two are not opposites at all, but instead feed each other until they are inseparable, like smoke curling back into the fire from which it came. We can sift through the dusty records. We can examine the police reports, the grainy photographs, the sworn testimonies, but for every piece of verifiable fact, there is another detail that defies reason, another connection that appears too precise to dismiss, yet too elusive to prove. And it is in this liminal space between what we can prove and what we can only suspect that the Fairfax legacy continues to live. Some will say the curse is nothing more than a metaphor for the destruction wrought by greed and ambition. Others will argue that the disappearances can be explained by political exile or covert operations gone wrong, and the cult ties dismissed. As conspiracy theory born from the paranoia of the Cold War era, yet the same people will falter when faced with the consistency of dates, the repeating names, the precise recurrence of locations that should have no reason to be connected. If we are honest with ourselves, we must admit that the Fairfax story persists not because of the gaps in evidence, but because of the places where evidence and impossibility meet and overlap. The haunted estate still stands its upper windows like dark eyes fixed on the tree line, and though ownership has changed hands several times in recent decades, none have remained for long. Residents speak of voices in the chimney, a persistent smell of iron in the cellar, and a set of footsteps that begins at the back door and stops halfway up the stairs, as if whoever is climbing is always listening before they take the next step. But the estate is only the surface layer. The real legacy is more diffuse, like a contagion, traveling along invisible channels. Those who dig too deeply into the Fairfax history seem to suffer a string of coincidences. Car accidents, sudden illness, inexplicable financial ruin, as though the story itself carries a cost to the teller. And so we are left with a final question, one that cannot be answered by archives or interviews or forensic analysis. If the Fairfax curse is real in whatever form, if the ninth passage is opening again, if the families tied to this lineage are still operating under its influence, then what exactly are they waiting for? What moment so significant that it justifies generations of secrecy, sacrifice, and fear? Perhaps it is not about power in the way we understand it. Perhaps it is about preservation, not of wealth or influence, but of something far older and more fragile, something that must be kept alive no matter the cost. When we speak of the Fairfax, we imagine a single family tree, but what if the truth is far more complex? What if the bloodline is only the vessel, and the thing it carries moves from host to host, across centuries, choosing those most capable of serving it? What if the real curse is not the misfortune that befalls the family, but the obligation to keep this thing hidden until the appointed time? And if that is the case, then the Fairfax name is just a mask, and when the mask is removed, we may find that we have been watching the wrong face all along. Even now there are whispers among those who have studied the documents and the symbols in private that the Fairfax were never the masters of this secret. They were the custodians, its jailers, perhaps even its victims. And if that is true, then the true danger is not in what they have done, but in what will happen when their control finally breaks. Because history has shown us one thing without fail every time. The pattern repeats, the cost is higher, the event is larger, and more lives are drawn into the shadow. And if the stories are right, then the next repetition is not far away. You can dismiss it as superstition if you wish, but remember that superstition is only the word we give to the things we cannot yet measure, and sometimes by the time we learn to measure them, it is already too late to stop what they have set in motion. So the Fairfax story remains unfinished, and perhaps it was always meant to be, because the final chapter is not written in ink. It is written in us, and when the ninth passage opens again, it will not just be their legacy we are talking about, it will be ours. Then let this be the last thing said about the Fairfax name, for there is a weight to certain truths that should not be passed from mouth to mouth without care, a weight that grows heavier the more it is shared, until it bends the spine and blurs the mind. You have walked through their halls. Now you have smelled the damp rot of their archives and felt the quiet press of the dark. Between each fact and each shadow you have seen how history can twist until it resembles prophecy, and how prophecy can harden until it becomes a map. The Fairfax curse, if we dare still call it, that is no longer theirs alone. For once a story enters your mind, it plants itself there, it waits. You can shrug it off. You can tell yourself it was only an old tale about a doomed family. But when the night is very still, and your own house creaks like something shifting in its sleep. You will remember the details. You will think of the patterns of the dates of the faces that recur in photographs, decades apart, and you will wonder if you have simply inherited the knowledge, or if the knowledge has inherited you. And perhaps this is why no one ever truly ends the Fairfax story. It is not a chain that can be broken or a book that can be closed. It is a slow contagion, moving from the page to the ear to the dream, and then into the waking world until you know. Longer remember where you first heard it, and yet you still feel watched, still feel chosen. The family is gone or scattered or hiding, but their work, their burden, their shadow continues. So if you speak of this, again choose your words carefully, for some stories are doors, and once opened, they do not close. Again, some stories are not meant to be told. They are meant to be carried in silence until the weight is too much, and even then, one should think long before setting it down, because you never know who might pick it up. And if the ninth passage truly waits to be opened, then perhaps your voice will be the one that unlocks it. And when that happens, there will be no Fairfax. Curse no Fairfax legacy. There will only be the thing itself, stepping out into the light after centuries in the dark, and it will not care whose name it wears then.